I left to answer the phone, and when I returned to the party, I saw my wife kissing another man, and I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. I said nothing. I just left the glass on the table and left, ending what she herself had already destroyed. I never returned to that house, or to that life. She tried to explain it to me later, but her lover had already made it clear it was just fun. Alone, she faced what she had lost. I followed a different path and, in time, found a new love, discreet, firm, and whole, someone who doesn't need to lie to love. When she reached out to me, I listened calmly. I forgave. No arguments, no hard feelings. And then, when she thought she had a free pass to get back together with her old marriage, I introduced her to my new wife, and that was when she understood I was already moving on. It was 5 years ago, but I can still remember the exact texture of the air that night. The muffled sound of the music coming from inside the house. The weight of the cell phone still warm in my hand, the golden light streaming through the living room windows, flickering like an ancient memory. I remember the moment I saw them both, her and him, and everything inside me stopped. No anger, no screams. Just that immense silence that comes when the soul cracks open. I didn't break anything. I didn't throw anyone out. I didn't defend myself. I just walked away. With the cruel lucidity of someone who understands, once and for all, that the love you feel for someone isn't enough to keep them from betraying you. And that night, that realization was more violent than any punch. She came running after me days later. She called me, texted me, wrote me letters. She showed up at my work door saying it was a mistake, that she was confused, that it was just a kiss, that it meant nothing. And maybe that's what it was, nothing. But that, nothing, cost us everything we'd built together. It wasn't just a kiss, it was the death of trust. It was like watching the ceiling collapse on your own body and realizing there was no way to save the rubble. The cruelest part of betrayal isn't always the act itself. It's the clarity that comes afterward, that the person you trusted most made a conscious choice to hurt you. She didn't stumble, she jumped in. I'm not perfect. I never have been. I've made mistakes too, with harsh words in stressful moments, with absences during difficult days, with unforgivable forgetfulness. But I was always there. I gave myself completely. She, it seems, was only there half the time. And it was in that half that he entered. She said it was just a moment, a lapse, an unresolved need. But how do you repair what was so precisely broken? It took a while for the silence to stop hurting. It took even longer for me to be able to look at a photo of her and not feel that mix of longing and disappointment piercing my chest like a sharp knife. She kept trying. Insisting. Promising new beginnings, better days, dinners to talk. And for a while, part of me wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe that love could survive this. That forgiveness could be enough. But every day I woke up alone in that new house, I realized the hole was deeper. That the love that remained was no longer healthy. It was a sick, wounded, lingering love. And I knew that if I went back, I would live in fear. Fear of answering the phone and losing everything again. Time was a bitter bomb. It pushed me away from her and pushed me inward. I began to see who I was outside of that relationship. I discovered dormant passions, reconnected with old friends, traveled to places she'd never wanted to visit. And on one of those trips, I met someone. It wasn't like before. There were no fireworks, no promises. There was just a strange peace, a feeling that I could be myself, without having to prove anything. She listened more than she spoke. And when she spoke, it was with firmness. She looked me in the eyes. And never, ever made me feel small. It started slowly. A coffee, a walk, a conversation about books. And suddenly, I was laughing again. Sleeping peacefully. Missing someone who carried no shadow of the past. Meanwhile, the other kept appearing. Sometimes subtly, other times almost desperately. I saw in her eyes what had once been mere pride, now it was regret. The real kind. The kind that hurts and corrodes inside. She even told me, with teary eyes, that she'd regretted it the very moment she felt his lips touch hers. That, even before opening her eyes, she'd known she'd destroyed something precious. But her words, now, no longer had the same effect. They were like letters that arrive too late. When the recipient has already changed address. There was no more room for hurt. Only a quiet, almost respectful emptiness. And I hid this new love for a long time. Not out of fear, but out of respect for my own process. I wanted to be sure I was whole before trying again. And when I felt strong enough to start over, I made the decision. I got married. Simply, elegantly, without fanfare. I didn't invite my ex. I didn't tell her. I thought it was enough to leave the past where it belonged. But she knew. She came to me a month later. More serene, thinner, more tired. She asked to talk. And this time, I accepted. We sat on a bench in the park where we used to walk on Sundays. She looked at me with sad tenderness and said she still loved me. That she understood if I no longer wanted anything, but she needed to tell me. That she spent nights thinking about what she lost. That she would have done everything differently. And it was in that moment that I understood what time had done to me. I forgave her. Not with words, but with a look. I no longer felt anger. Nor pain. Only compassion. And a certain distant affection for the one who, one day, made me feel like I was enough. She smiled then, thinking that forgiveness was a bridge. That it meant there was still a chance. But before she could say anything, I opened my wallet, took out a photo, and showed it to her. It was a picture of my newborn daughter. The girl carried in her name what had once been just a dream of ours. And in that moment, her smile faded. The penny dropped. I had moved on. For real. With someone else. With a new family. And the tribute, the child's name, was the most beautiful and cruel irony. I continued the plan we once dreamed of together, only with someone who never betrayed me. She didn't cry. She just remained silent. And that was how we said goodbye. Without regret. Without hope. Only with the certainty that some losses are irreversible. And that time cannot be returned, no matter how much you regret it. What she did wasn't just betrayal. It was robbing herself of the chance to be forever. And now, every time she sees that name, on social media, in the news, in friends' conversations, she remembers that that girl could have been her daughter too. But she wasn't. Because the day she decided to kiss another man, she also decided to give up the future we had. And what she doesn't know, is that that night, before leaving to answer the phone, I was about to announce a surprise. A gift I'd bought. A testament of love. But fate arrived before I could speak. And what was supposed to be a night of celebration turned into the day everything changed forever. Now tell me, what would you do if you knew you lost the love of your life, for 5 seconds of emotion? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize betrayal, we condemn. All the stories you hear are fictional, but based on emotional truths that thousands of people have experienced. Our purpose is clear: show how betrayal destroys, marks and changes lives forever. Get ready. What you're about to hear is shocking, intense and unforgettable. Good story. They met on an autumn afternoon that seemed unremarkable, but which would become the starting point of a story that, for a time, almost seemed perfect. His name was Daniel. He was the type who spoke little but listened a lot. A man with a serene presence, an unhurried gaze, and gestures that said more than words could. Her name was Laura. A woman full of life, with an easy laugh and a restless spirit, with a natural charisma that made everyone around her feel welcome. While he was earth, she was wind. And that was precisely why it worked so well in the beginning. He offered security, stability, purpose. She, lightness, warmth, newness. Deep down, they both carried different traumas and silent desires for a love that was more than passion. They wanted something that would endure, even when everything else changed. Lara came from tumultuous, shallow relationships, from loves that exhausted themselves before they even learned to breathe. When she met Daniel, she felt for the first time the calm of being truly seen. He wasn't impressed by her exaggerations or her theatrical intensity. It was as if he already knew who she was inside, even before she admitted it. And that disarmed her. Daniel, for his part, had lived for years in a predictable and controlled routine. He was methodical, detail-oriented, with a stable career in architecture and a small but loyal circle of friends. The day he met Lara was the first in a long time that he deviated from a plan. She arrived with her spontaneity, her disorderly words, her eyes that laughed before smiling, and unlocked a side of him he had almost forgotten existed. They started slowly. Neither of them was too young for childish games or uncertainties. They learned each other patiently, and before long, they knew each other's most subtle tastes, their favorite ice cream flavor, the movie that made them cry in secret, the smell of their pillows at their mother's house, the music that reminded them of childhood. Over time, their love grew steadily, not like a fire, but like a building. They didn't consume each other, they grew stronger. They traveled to simple places, shared silences without discomfort, cooked on Sundays while dancing without music in the kitchen. When they decided to live together, everything felt natural. Neither of them questioned it. It was as if that step had already been written between the lines of their relationship from the first glance. The apartment where they began their life together was small, but full of thoughtful details. Every corner bore the mark of a gesture. The bookshelf he designed especially for her books. The photos taped to the wall with gold tape. The plant that kept dying, but which she insisted on replanting, believing that someday it would thrive. The two learned to share their daily lives like someone learning a new language. With strangeness, stumbles, mistakes and successes, but with a genuine desire to understand each other. When they argued, it wasn't with shouts, but with pauses. They knew their own limits and, most importantly, they knew how to apologize. The connection between them was palpable. Friends commented on the way they looked at each other. Co-workers, upon meeting them at parties or events, said they seemed to come from the same place, as if they were pieces of the same puzzle. But no story is made of applause alone. And yes, behind the smiles, there were small cracks. Lara, despite her love for Daniel, sometimes missed the whirlwind. The unpredictability that had always characterized her previous relationships. The balance sometimes bored her. She didn't say it out loud. Not even to herself. But she found herself, at times, longing for something that would lift her off the solid ground Daniel offered. He, though satisfied in many ways, carried a dull fear of not being enough. Perhaps out of old insecurity, perhaps out of intuition. Some days, he woke up feeling like he needed to do more, be more. He blamed himself for not surprising her often enough, for not being as fun as her friends, for not having that same spontaneous spark. But he never talked about it. He kept it all to himself, as if protecting the relationship were a silent task only he could accomplish. However, these small concerns weren't enough to shake what they were building. At least, not yet. The two continued to grow together, building a solid foundation. They bought a car together, started planning long trips, and talked openly about children. Daniel, especially, seemed ready. He'd already started setting aside part of his income for future savings, mentally designed the baby's room, and even chosen the school he'd like to visit with her when the time came. Lara laughed at his anticipations. She thought it was cute. She said he was the only man in the world who wanted to build a crib before proposing. And he, with a shy smile, said that when you know, you know. The two had been in the same group of friends for years, with monthly get-togethers filled with wine, music, and long conversations late into the night. These were the moments Lara looked forward to most. It was there that she felt most alive, surrounded by stories, laughter, and possibilities. Daniel, though more reserved, made a point of being present. He didn't quite fit into that more extroverted rhythm, but not for lack of interest. He enjoyed seeing her in that state of expansive joy. And out of love, he immersed himself in that universe, even when he felt it wasn't quite his place. Life continued with its ups and downs. There was a particularly difficult year when Lara lost her father. Daniel was her support. Silent, firm, always nearby. He brought her coffee without her asking, accompanied her on cemetery visits, left notes hidden in unlikely places. She cried with her head on his chest as if that were the only place in the world where she could exist without needing to be strong. And he was proud to be that for her, a safe haven. It was that same year that they finally decided to get engaged. They had a small celebration in the backyard of a couple's house. Nothing extravagant. Just intimate moments, low lights, and a playlist full of meaning. That day, she wore a simple dress with her hair in an improvised updo. And she had never looked so beautiful in his eyes. During the toast, she said she had found in him the peace she never knew she needed. And he, with tears in his eyes, replied that he had waited his whole life for someone like her. The guests applauded, smiled, and recorded that moment as if witnessing something rare. With the engagement came plans for marriage, a new home, and a trip abroad. Daniel was excited. Involved in every detail. But without pressure. He respected her time, he knew Lara needed freedom to breathe, to think, to feel. And although she loved him, she sometimes felt overwhelmed by such dedication. Sometimes she wondered if she could reciprocate. If that immense love wasn't too much for her, who had always been characterized by instability. But she quickly pushed those thoughts away. She told herself that love also meant learning to settle, to hold her own. And that Daniel, with his calm, was the best place in the world to learn all this. That was the phase they were in. The phase in which everything seemed on track, under control, promising. Life had its rhythms, its common conflicts, its difficult days and others wonderfully light. But deep down, everything was heading toward a happy ending. At least, that's what everyone seemed to believe. And perhaps it was precisely this complete trust, this excess of certainty, that prevented them from noticing the small signs. The imperceptible details. The long pauses. The averted glances. The nights when she took longer than usual to return. The messages he pretended not to see. The silences that began to stretch. But nothing had been said yet. No line had been crossed, at least, not openly. What existed was the weight of what still had no name. The subtle unease of someone beginning to realize that, perhaps, the story they're living isn't exactly what they imagined. And yet, they both continued on. Together. Unaware that soon, the love they seemed to have saved, would be the same one that would bring them face to face with the most profound loss of their lives. The routine continued with its silent rhythm of imperceptible accumulations. Daniel remained involved in the wedding preparations, now dividing his weekends between meetings with suppliers, visits to potential honeymoon destinations, and meetings with her family to finalize the ceremony details. There was a serene gleam in his eyes with each step forward, as if the realization of that dream were confirmation that everything he had experienced before, all the failures and waiting, finally made sense. Lara, on the other hand, seemed to oscillate between enthusiasm and a kind of emotional exhaustion she couldn't explain. Sometimes she was present, attentive, involved in choosing the flowers and the guest list. At other times, she was distracted, silent, her gaze lost in empty spots in the room, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The days grew shorter as the official date approached. They had been engaged for months, and despite some setbacks, everything indicated that the wedding would be a memorable event. His family admired his dedication to the relationship, while her friends praised his patience and sweetness. He was the kind of man everyone said was rare. The kind of man who cares, who commits, who is always willing to make things work. But there was something in Lara's gestures that began to change almost imperceptibly. The hugs became shorter, the kisses more mechanical, the compliments less frequent. Daniel initially interpreted it as fatigue, the pressure of marriage, the insecurities that occasionally arise when the commitment actually approaches. He preferred not to create conflict. He chose to give space. He believed that love was also silence, and that time would reorganize what seemed out of step. Lara started going out more at night. She said she needed to clear her head, meet friends, get her head together. He trusted her. He was never the controlling type, never asked for her cell phone password, never questioned who the people she was hanging out with were. He believed trust couldn't be imposed, you either have it or it goes. And he would rather have it than watch her every move. But he began to notice the changes. The different scent she smelled when she got home. The recurring lateness on Thursday nights. The vague answers when he asked how dinner with her friends went. The evasive glances. The coldness disguised as fatigue. Her body present, but her mind distant. And even with all the signs, he tried to convince himself it was just a phase. The last one before a new beginning. One Friday, Daniel prepared a special dinner. He cooked her favorite dish, lit candles, and played the playlist they'd used to listen to during their first weeks together. He was determined to recapture what he felt was slipping through the cracks of everyday life. Lara arrived 2 hours later than planned. Her hair was tied up messily, her eyes darting away from his, and she wore a smile that showed she was trying to appear surprised but couldn't hide her discomfort. They sat at the table. They ate in silence. He talked about the wedding buffet, the messages her mother had sent, the possibility of an alternative honeymoon destination. She nodded, as if in another room, another world. And at the end of dinner, she simply said she needed a shower. He simply nodded, clearing the plates, swallowing that emptiness with the same delicacy with which he cleaned the silverware. The following week, she had a work trip. 3 days away. She said it would be tiring, that she wouldn't have time to respond to many messages, that she would be returning straight to an appointment with her mother. He drove her to the airport, wished her luck, and held her hand longer than usual. She smiled tenderly, but soon turned her face away to look ahead. During the days he was away, Daniel wrote a letter. It wasn't a traditional love note. It was almost a confession. A sincere record of everything he was feeling. Of the insecurities, the doubts, the longing for a connection that was once alive and now seemed absent. He put the letter in the envelope and left it on his desk. But when Lara returned, he didn't have the courage to deliver it. He sensed that, at that moment, she wouldn't know what to make of those words. He preferred to wait a little longer. Maybe things would get better. Maybe she was just tired. One night, they were invited to a party at the house of a mutual friend. It was one of those events they used to love. Good music, familiar faces, and a casual atmosphere. Daniel hesitated, but Lara insisted. She said they needed to relax. He agreed. They arrived together, holding hands, as always. At the beginning of the evening, they seemed fine. They chatted with friends, laughed, and toasted. Daniel even began to believe this would be a new turning point. That this night would mark the rediscovery of something that had been lost through carelessness. Lara was more relaxed, dancing, smiling lightly, and chatting with everyone with her usual brilliance. He, though quieter, watched with admiration. He was still in love with her. He still believed they could overcome any crisis. Daniel's phone rang close to midnight. It was an office colleague with an urgent question about an ongoing project. He went outside to answer it, crossed the house's garden, and walked to the side gate, where the noise was quieter. It took a few minutes. When he hung up, he took a deep breath, rehearsing going back inside. And then, through the large glass window in the living room, he saw her. Her. With someone else. The kiss wasn't confusing, wasn't accidental. It was firm, committed, charged with intention. Time stood still. The sounds faded. His heart didn't race, it just stopped. He didn't come in. He didn't make a fuss. He didn't confront her. He walked to the table where he'd left his glass, grabbed his coat, straightened his shirt collar, and walked out the front door. In silence. As if understanding, in that exact second, that something inside him had died forever. He didn't sleep that night. He drove aimlessly for hours. The city seemed motionless, frozen in a landscape that no longer made sense. When morning came, he was parked in front of their apartment building. But he didn't go in. He sent a single message, asking her to pick up her things in 2 days. He said he'd be out. He didn't want to hear excuses. And he did. He spent the weekend in a simple hotel, his phone turned off, trying to organize everything in his head that would never be explained. Lara tried. She called dozens of times. She sent messages, emails, even letters. She said she was confused, that the kiss meant nothing, that she didn't know what had gotten into her. But it was too late. Daniel wasn't the kind of man to shout. He was the kind of man to withdraw. And that time, it was definitive. He didn't speak to anyone for the next few days. He only answered the essentials. He went to work as usual. He walked the streets with the same stride as before. But inside, something was missing. There was a part of him that could no longer be reached. The weeks passed. And with them, the realization that all of this was irreversible. Lara didn't insist for long. She began to accept his silence as the clearest answer she could receive. Daniel didn't speak ill of her to anyone. He didn't reveal the reason for the separation. He simply closed himself off. He kept his grief to himself. There was no need to expose what hurt. Because it hurt too much. Deep down, the worst part wasn't being betrayed. It was being betrayed by the one he believed in most. The one he planned to share the rest of his life with. That night at the party, everything changed. And as he packed his last remaining souvenirs into a cardboard box, he found something forgotten at the bottom of a drawer. A small, harmless object, but it held the key to a discovery he hadn't imagined until then. A secret even greater than the betrayal. And it was in that moment, that he realized that the pain he had felt until then, was just the beginning. The small envelope was folded in half, hidden by some forgotten papers, at the bottom of the dresser drawer he had once shared with her. Daniel didn't see it right away. He was just emptying the last corners of the house, preparing his final exit, when that piece of paper, so out of place among the others, caught his eye. He opened the envelope on impulse, never imagining that inside lay the remnants of a choice that would change everything. It was a handwritten letter, in Lara's sloppy handwriting, addressed to someone whose name he didn't know. At first, he thought it was just another old note, some emotional scribble from the days when she wrote about her feelings, but as he read the first line, he felt his lungs deflate as if the air were running out. The letter wasn't for him. It wasn't about longing or regret. It was a confession. A surrender. A still open wound. She wrote as if she needed to lift a weight. She described details, memories, specific situations. She talked about how alive she felt with that other man, even though she knew it wouldn't last. She said she felt guilty, but at the same time liberated. That she no longer knew if she loved Daniel or just liked the idea of being with someone like him. But what hurt most, what transformed the pain into something irreversible, was the final paragraph. There, with cutting words and no remorse whatsoever, she revealed that she had known, weeks before the betrayal happened, that she wouldn't get married. That she stayed with Daniel only because she didn't know how to leave him, because he was too good to be hurt by the harsh truth. And that the kiss at the party wasn't an accident, it was a decision. Cold, calculated, so that he would see, so that he would understand for himself that she was no longer there. Daniel dropped the letter onto the bed. His hands trembled. His head seemed to spin. The world around him lost its sound, as if he'd plunged into an empty aquarium. It was as if time had returned to that night, to that exact moment he'd seen her with another man. Now he knew it hadn't been a slip of the tongue. It hadn't been an impulse. It had been a period written with intention. For long minutes, he sat there, motionless, listening only to his own breathing, trying to stay steady. He didn't know if he was angry, shocked, sorry, or simply filled with emptiness. The truth was, everything he thought had been good between them now seemed tarnished, corrupted by that revelation. Lara showed up that same afternoon. She'd texted him that she was going to pick up her last belongings. She didn't know he'd be there. When she saw him, she tried to hide her shock. She was thinner, her eyes tired, her words less sharp. There was something about her that seemed more humble, less in control of the world. She asked if she could come in, but he didn't answer. He simply stepped aside to let her pass. She walked through the house with silent steps, avoiding his gaze, until, upon reaching the bedroom, she saw the letter on the bed. She stopped. Swallowed hard. She knew exactly what it was. She didn't need to touch it. She didn't need to ask. She simply turned to him and said, in a low voice, almost a whisper of defeat, that she never wanted him to read it. Daniel stared at her for long seconds, as if searching for something in the face of someone he no longer recognizes, and asked if the love she claimed to feel had ever been true. She sat on the edge of the bed, pulled her hair back, and began to cry. Not a dramatic, scandalous cry. It was the restrained, stifled cry of someone who finally allows herself to feel the guilt of everything she's caused. She said she had loved, yes, very much. That the problem was never him. That the fault was hers, always hers. That she never knew how to handle peace. That she was accustomed to relationships that destroyed her, and when she found someone who wanted to build it, she simply didn't know how to react. She said the kiss was a scream, a cry for help, an unconscious way of escaping the stable life she'd always wanted, but which, deep down, terrified her. And then she confessed, she'd written the letter to say goodbye to the other man, but hadn't had the courage to deliver it. And even so, with everything she felt, she hesitated to tell Daniel the truth because, deep down, she hoped he would forgive her simply by remaining silent. That he would continue pretending he knew nothing. But he knew. And now, the truth was there, naked, between them. Daniel listened to her without interrupting. I didn't say I understood her. I didn't say I hated her. I just let her speak, as if those words were the last thing that still connected them. When she finished, he walked to the window, remained silent for a few moments, and said that what hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself, but the fact that she decided to destroy him because she didn't have the courage to be honest. That, in that moment, he no longer saw in her the woman he fell in love with, but only the reflection of someone who used his love as a shelter until she could escape. She tried to get closer, to touch him, to apologize again, but he backed away. He said he held no hatred, that forgiveness already existed, but that there was nothing left there. No desire for a new beginning. No fantasy of reconciliation. The love I felt for her died in that letter. Or maybe before, that night. But now it was buried for good. Lara stood, unsure what to do with her hands. She asked if he'd fallen in love again. He didn't answer. He just stared at the photo on the shelf, where a small, serene face smiled at the camera. She approached slowly, recognizing for the first time the child she'd heard so much about in recent months. A name she herself helped choose years ago, in a moment of pure illusion, when they still talked about children, futures, promises they didn't know they couldn't keep. She read the name in the frame. And there, in that moment, she understood. Daniel hadn't just moved on. He had continued the dream that had once been hers, but with someone else. And her daughter's name, that name, was like a shattered mirror piercing her chest. It was the name they'd chosen together, on any given Sunday, over coffee and laughter, when they believed love was enough. She turned her face slowly, her eyes filled with unshed tears. Daniel finally broke the silence. He said he'd named his daughter that not out of nostalgia, but as a symbol of what he'd once wanted to be eternal. He said that child was proof that, despite everything, love was still possible. That he hadn't died with her. That she'd been reborn in another story, with someone who never needed to hurt him to feel alive. And that now he understood, true love doesn't hurt like that. It doesn't destroy, it doesn't confuse, it doesn't tear you apart. Lara walked away without another word. She gathered her things in silence. And before leaving, she looked at Daniel one last time, as if begging for a second to last longer than necessary. But he was no longer there. His presence was solid, but his soul had already inhabited another place. A place she no longer had access to. And in that moment, as she closed the door, she understood with painful clarity that it was no longer a choice. It was an absence. A definitive absence. She walked to the car with firm steps, but inside, everything in her trembled. For the first time, he felt what true loss was. Not the loss of wounded pride, nor the loss of shattered illusions. But the loss of a real love, the kind that happens once in a lifetime, and once gone, never returns. And even surrounded by silence, familiar streets, and persistent memories, she knew that the echo of that childish name, delicate and untouchable, would haunt her forever. Because there was the living memory of the future he had destroyed with his own hands. And nothing I said, did, or felt could change that now. Lara didn't return for anything else. What was left behind like the remnants of a time that no longer fit into any bag. Daniel closed that door with the firmness of someone closing not just a chapter, but an entire narrative that no longer belonged to him. In the days that followed, he remained centered. He returned to work, focused on his routine with his daughter, now just a year and a half old, and on his new wife who, with the rare patience of someone who loves generously, knew how to understand his silences without pressing for words. The reunion with Lara left no doubt. There were no leftovers, no emotional lingerings. What existed now was simply life as it was, concrete, present, rebuilt on real, solid, and whole foundations. But like every self-respecting final point, this one still needed to find its final echo. 2 weeks after the conversation in the apartment, Daniel received an unexpected invitation. It was a charity event organized by a foundation he had recently joined, influenced by his current wife. An elegant, discreet dinner focused on social causes. He said he might not go, but she encouraged him to go. She said he needed to allow himself to return to places that weren't connected to the past, but rather to what they were building now. He relented. He put on his dark suit, calmly adjusted his tie, and, for the first time in a long time, looked in the mirror and didn't see the reflection of a broken man. He was someone else. Someone whole. The hall was spacious, the kind of place that echoed with footsteps like memories. The lights were soft, the music low, important people chatted in subdued voices while waiters floated between the tables with glasses of wine and small plates. He arrived at his wife's side, holding hands, as he always did, but now with a light touch. They were greeted elegantly, greeted by acquaintances, and led to a table near the stage. During the speeches and tributes, Daniel kept his attention divided between the event and the touch of her hand on his knee, a simple gesture that anchored him. She was everything Lara couldn't be, firm without being rigid, intense without being hurtful, passionate without being suffocating. It was in her that he now found his future. It was near the end of the evening, as the guests began to disperse, that he saw her. Lara stood alone on the other side of the room, dressed soberly, her hair tied in a discreet bun, her gaze averted the moment it met his. She hesitated, as if debating whether or not to cross the chasm that time had built between them. But she didn't approach him. She simply stared at him for a few seconds too long before returning her attention to the glass in her hand. Daniel wasn't bothered. He felt, for a brief moment, a pang of something he couldn't name, but it quickly dissipated with his wife's subtle touch beckoning him to leave. He nodded, stood discreetly, and, before leaving, glanced at Lara one last time. She didn't notice. She was too absorbed, perhaps in an inner world only she understood. In the car, his wife commented that the woman was looking at him intensely. Daniel smiled without irony and replied simply that she was a woman from the past. She didn't ask any more questions. She trusted him. That was what sustained them. In the following days, Daniel returned to his usual life. But then, a message arrived. From a number he'd no longer saved. It was short. No drama. It simply said, "Would you allow me one last conversation? Something I've saved for the right moment." He considered ignoring it. But something in the tone of the message didn't sound like a plea for reconciliation. It was deeper. He replied with a location and a time. A discreet cafe in the old neighborhood, where the city noise wasn't so deafening. He'd scheduled it for mid-afternoon. He knew his wife would be with their daughter. He wanted to avoid any discomfort. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Lara arrived punctually. There was no exaggerated makeup, no forced smiles. She sat across from him and, for the first time in a long time, seemed smaller. Not in size, but in energy. The woman who once dominated the room with her charisma now carried the shoulders of someone who learned, too late, the price of her own choices. Daniel ordered 2 coffees and waited. She didn't beat around the bush. She said she wasn't there to ask for anything. That she didn't want anything in return, no friendship, not another chance. That she knew everything had already been decided, and that he was now somewhere else. But she needed to say something she'd never had the courage to say. A detail from the night it all ended, something she'd kept to herself out of shame, fear, and cowardice. She took a deep breath. Her voice shook, but she continued. She said that night at the party, before the kiss, she had written a note. Not a letter, but a simple one. He had left it in the car, hidden in his bag, intending to deliver it later. In it, I said I couldn't stand living between 2 truths anymore. That I loved Daniel, but I wasn't sure if I still wanted the life they had planned. That something in her was gasping for air. That I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. That I didn't want to hurt him, but I didn't know how to leave without seeming cruel. He said that, instead of talking, he did the unthinkable, he exposed the betrayal. He chose the quickest, most cowardly way out. And that he regretted it, not only for the pain he had caused, but for having destroyed the only thing that was real in his life. Daniel listened without moving. His eyes fixed on her, but his heart anchored elsewhere. When she finished, he simply asked why she was saying this now. She replied that, upon seeing his daughter in the portrait, with the name that had once been a shared dream, she realized she could no longer live with that trapped inside her. That she needed to free it completely. That he had already moved on, but she still carried the ghost of omission. And that she wanted him to know that, even though she hadn't done anything right, she was still grateful. Because only after losing everything can you understand the value of what you had. The silence between them stretched. There were no more questions. No room for hurt. Daniel simply said he wanted her to find herself. To be truly happy. She smiled sadly and said it would be difficult. That she would learn to live with the pain, but she didn't know if she would ever find peace. And then she stood up. She paid the bill before he could stop her. She said that this was the last time they would see each other. That now he could finally move on without a shadow. And she left. Daniel stood there for a few minutes, staring out the window, watching life outside continue its flow. He picked up his phone and texted his wife, "I'm coming back. I love you." He put the phone away, took a deep breath, and went outside. The day was clear, the air light, and for the first time since the end, he felt something inside him had also ended. Not with hatred. Not with pain. But with understanding. Some loves don't last, not for lack of feeling, but for an excessive absence of truth. And now, everything made sense. The past, however cruel, had given her something immense, the chance to start over with someone who knew how to love the right way. And so he continued. Without carrying any more weight. While she, somewhere in the city, learned to live with the sound of a name that would never be called by a childish voice that would recognize her as mother. The drive home that afternoon was filled with a different silence. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of someone mulling over memories or trying to piece together answers in an emotional puzzle. It was a kind of mature, silent peace that only comes after the most devastating storm, when the world doesn't exactly return to how it was, but settles into a new, denser, more real form. Daniel walked through the door and found his wife playing with their daughter in the living room. The child's laughter echoed like music, and for a moment he paused in the hallway just to absorb that simple yet life-filled scene. Her wife looked at him, smiled as if she felt and understood without needing to ask, and he responded with a calm yet meaningful look. That moment needed no words. It was the now, the real, what remained after all that was false was left behind. That last conversation with Lara carried no weight, nor any guilt. It merely confirmed that he had made the right choice in following a different path. The pain, though still lodged in some drawers of his memory, no longer had the power to govern his days. But at the same time, there was something he couldn't ignore, the knowledge that someone, at some point in their life, had been left behind, trying to stitch together the edges of a story they themselves had torn. And it was this moral dilemma that sometimes awakened him on specific nights, when the world grew quiet and the only thing left was his own thoughts, torn between reason and compassion. Because as much as he had been betrayed, deceived, and left emotionally adrift, Daniel knew he had shared years with someone who, however imperfect, was an essential part of his emotional fabric. And it was strange to accept that now, all that remained of that connection was a faded memory. His wife sensed something had changed within him. It wasn't doubt, nor longing, but a kind of heightened awareness, as if he had passed through an invisible portal and returned different, more whole, more aware of what he wanted and, most importantly, what he no longer wanted. She respected this. She continued to love him with the same serenity as always, but now there was a deeper understanding between them, as if he had finally closed all the previous chapters and was, at last, living this new story with a clean heart, without ghosts, without shadows. It was at that moment that they began to plan changes. Nothing drastic, but symbolic. They decided to move house, looking for a new space, larger, more open, with more light, where they could create new memories without bumping into the traces of the past. The move brought with it a sense of genuine new beginnings. Each unpacked box seemed to carry not only objects but also meanings. His daughter began walking through the still empty hallways, tripping over her own feet, laughing with her arms outstretched as if celebrating this new place. Daniel watched it all with full eyes. He knew time wouldn't go back, that the scars remained, but he felt proud to have made it through without becoming bitter, without using his pain as a weapon, without allowing betrayal to shape his identity. He had been betrayed, yes, but not corrupted. And that was a silent victory few could achieve. One Sunday morning, while they were having coffee in the backyard, his wife asked him if he felt at peace. He took a while to answer. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to tell him exactly. She said yes, that she felt a different kind of peace, not the naive one that precedes troubles, but the one that comes after war, when one knows the pain, the limits, the ruins, and yet chooses to live with an open heart. She held his hand, as firmly as ever, and he knew that gesture held all the answers they needed. On the other side of the city, Lara lived a much less poetic daily life. She tried to maintain her routine, her work, her friendships, but there was something about her that was always a little off. That conversation with Daniel had freed her in one sense, but imprisoned her in another. Because now she knew, with irreversible clarity, that she had lost something she could never rebuild. She had seen the reflection of what she had destroyed in his eyes, and there was no longer room for fantasizing about reunions or new beginnings. She was alone. And it wasn't the loneliness of not having someone by her side, but of no longer being able to recognize herself in the choices she had made. Her subsequent relationships were brief, unsatisfying, sometimes superficial. Not for lack of trying, but because none of them carried the same weight of truth that she had once found, and lost, in Daniel's eyes. One night, she was invited to a dinner with professional colleagues. A formal affair, full of familiar faces and forced smiles. She sat at the table with a lively group, but kept a slight distance, sipping her wine slowly. Amidst the chatter, she overheard one of the women commenting on a new sustainable architecture firm that was gaining traction. When the name of the person in charge was mentioned, she felt a chill run down her spine. It was him. Daniel. His name was mentioned with respect, admiration. A praised professional, recognized for his work, his ethics, his commitment. But it was the next comment that touched her most, and he's married to an incredible woman, you know. Those two have a rare connection, it's like they were made for each other. She didn't react. She just smiled discreetly, while inside, she felt the world spin. Not with pain, but with awareness. It was official. The world had moved on. Without her. In the days that followed, she reflected deeply on everything she'd experienced, on every choice she'd made. And although she felt the weight of guilt, she knew that part of growing up was not trying to mend what was broken inside. She decided to stop hiding behind guilt and, for the first time in a long time, began seeking help. Not to win someone back, but to rebuild herself. She began therapy, resumed old projects, invested in courses, and traveled alone. She wanted to find herself again. Not to be forgiven, but to, perhaps one day, forgive herself. Daniel, meanwhile, turned his attention to the present. He celebrated his daughter's second birthday with a small party in the backyard of their new home. He invited a few friends and close family. They were all there, smiling, laughing, singing happy birthday while the little girl clapped, not quite understanding what was happening, but visibly enchanted by the glow of those little lights. In the midst of the celebration, he noticed his wife holding the child in her arms, smiling tenderly. He approached, enveloping them both in a long embrace. That was it. That was what was left. And what was left was everything. Later that evening, as they put away the decorations and tidied up the scattered toys, his wife commented on how special the day had been. Daniel, looking up at the darkening sky above them, said there was something magical about being able to build a new story after so much pain. She smiled, that smile he'd learned to recognize as home, and replied that the best stories aren't those that start out perfect, but those that survive their own mistakes, their falls, their losses. And that, in the end, what matters isn't what was lost, but what was found afterward. Daniel didn't answer. He just moved closer, wrapping her in a silent, firm embrace. In that moment, there were no ghosts. There was no past. There was only that moment. Real. Alive. And enough. The morning after his daughter's birthday began with the smell of cake still perfuming the kitchen and toys scattered around the living room, like fragments of a day that, though simple, held a quiet grandeur. While his wife tidied up the small decorations left in the yard, Daniel sat at the table, reading an email about a new project in another city, an unexpected invitation to take over leadership of a growing branch. It was a tempting offer, with a higher salary, new challenges, and a promising career path, but more than that, it was the concrete possibility of a fresh start in every sense, far from places that still whispered memories of what was no longer part of his life. He looked out the window and saw his wife pushing their daughter's swing, laughing with her, the sunlight streaming through her hair, and he knew this decision couldn't be made alone. Not anymore. He was now part of something bigger than himself. That night, after they put their daughter to bed, they sat together on the porch. He told her about the proposal, the details, the deadlines, the impacts. She listened attentively, without interrupting, her face serious but serene. When he finished, she was silent for a few seconds before asking if he wanted to go. Daniel said yes, that part of him felt like breathing fresh air, building new bonds, living in a place where he wouldn't bump into faces from the past at every corner. She nodded and, with a gentle smile, said that wherever they went, as long as they were together, would be home. And it was at that point that everything began to move once again. Within a few weeks, they had decided on a new address, their daughter's enrollment in a new school secured, the moving truck scheduled. And, surprisingly, everything felt light, as if the universe conspired in favor of those who truly decide to start over. The new home was a single-story house surrounded by tall trees, with a spacious backyard and a side porch where the sun gently hit in the mornings. Life there took on a different rhythm. Family walks became part of the routine, conversations on the porch extended even after his daughter was asleep, and Daniel gradually realized that the geographical distance from the past also helped heal the last inner layers that were still healing. Now there was a more centered, more present, more conscious daily life. And perhaps that was the biggest difference: he was whole. For the first time in a long time, he felt he was living without dragging the debris of any previous history. Lara, on the other hand, learned of the change by chance, through a mutual friend who met her at a cafe and mentioned it offhandedly. She feigned naturalness, responding with a polite smile, but deep inside, something pierced her. She no longer expected reconciliation, she harbored no hope, but the idea that he was, in fact, moving on to another physical and emotional space made her understand how definitive everything had become. That night, alone in her apartment, she opened an old folder on her computer where she kept photos, videos, small records of a time that would never return. She observed his face in so many images and realized that Daniel's expression back then was different. It was light, surrendered. And although she had destroyed it with her own hands, the longing for that look hurt her like a slowly cutting blade. In the months that followed, she immersed herself in work, took courses, changed jobs, adopted a dog, and even tried to start a new relationship with a coworker. But everything was lukewarm, everything seemed pale in comparison to the intensity of what she had experienced and failed to preserve. One rainy afternoon, while walking alone through a park near her new apartment, she came across a scene that made her pause for a moment. A man, hand in hand with his young daughter, was teaching her to ride a bike. The child fell, got up, cried, laughed, and he was there, patiently by her side, never giving up. The image was simple, but held a brutal beauty. And Lara, who had always considered herself too free for such traditional constructs, felt a tightness in her chest. It was as if that vision revealed everything she had once held in her hands but failed to appreciate. Meanwhile, in his new city, Daniel continued to expand his career. The company trusted him, his colleagues respected him, and his leadership was admired not only for its efficiency but also for the human approach to projects. At home, his daughter grew up curious, smart, and full of life. Little by little, they began planning short trips, weekends at the beach, game nights, and movie nights. His wife, besides being his life partner, became his professional foundation, supporting him in his decisions, listening to his doubts, and celebrating every small achievement with him. That relationship didn't involve grand daily declarations, but was built silently, with consistent gestures, with presence. And he knew, with every fiber of his being, that this was the right love. The love that endures, that grows, that builds. But a dilemma still loomed, silent, like a shadow. Daniel knew that sooner or later, he would have to tell his daughter about the past. Not about the betrayal, not about the pain, but about her roots. He wanted her to grow up knowing the truth, without distorted stories. He knew that Lara's absence from her life was an inevitable choice, but a painful one nonetheless. And he often wondered when the right time would be. Some nights, watching her sleep, he wondered if one day she would look at him and ask, with questioning eyes, "Why isn't she here?" And he still didn't have a clear answer. One winter afternoon, he received an envelope in the mail, with no return address. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, with handwriting he recognized immediately. It was from Lara. The letter was brief, but carried a weight that overflowed between the lines. It said it didn't want to intrude or disturb. That it had understood its place. But that it wanted, if possible, just a meeting with the girl. Not to assume any role, not to confuse, but to see her, from afar, just once. He said he expected nothing. That he would understand if the answer was no. But he had to try. Daniel took days to decide. He talked to his wife, explaining everything carefully. She listened, considered, and reflected silently before saying that, although it might be painful, perhaps it was also necessary. Not for Lara, nor for them, but for her daughter. So that she could grow up without gaps in her stories, without questions, without a chance of being answered. And so, with a broken heart, he responded. He arranged to meet at a neutral park, on any given day, without telling his daughter what would happen. He simply said they would have a different afternoon, and she, excited as always, happily accepted. They arrived at the park at the appointed time. Lara was already there, sitting on a bench, her eyes fixed on the ground. When she saw the girl running to the swing, she froze. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move. Daniel approached, stood beside her for a few moments, silent. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, "She's even more beautiful than I imagined." He simply nodded. He said the girl didn't know who she was, that she was just there to play, like any other day. Lara respected him. She stood there for 20 minutes, watching from afar. She didn't try to approach. She didn't call out. She didn't smile. She simply observed. Before leaving, she stood, thanked him with her eyes, and walked slowly out of the park. Daniel followed her with his gaze, and in that instant, he understood, there was, finally, true closure. No screaming. No reconciliation. Just acceptance of what life, with all its twists and turns, had become. On the way home, his daughter was asleep in the back seat. His wife, upon hearing everything, simply hugged him. She told him he was brave, that he had done the right thing. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt there was no longer any dilemma. The truth was there. Alive. Complete. No loose ends. And from that moment on, all that was left was to live. Not with the weight of what he had been through, but with the lightness of someone who survived and chose to love again. You chose right. You chose to be whole. Time doesn't announce its twists and turns clearly, it doesn't make a fuss when it changes the course of life, but one day, when you look back, you realize everything is already a different place. Years have passed since that last encounter in the park. The girl grew up, now 9 years old, intelligent, sensitive, with a sweetness that overflowed in her smallest gestures. Daniel taught her to respect her feelings, to acknowledge her emotions, and, above all, to trust silence, because he himself learned that not everything needs to be said out loud to be understood deeply. She knew there were parts of her story that would still be told at the right time, and she trusted her father completely for that. The new house, now filled with memories, became her true home. The walls that once seemed like mere structures of a new beginning were now lined with moments, laughter spread throughout the hallways, the smell of new recipes, rainy afternoons with board games, Sundays with long coffees, and mornings where happiness manifested itself in gestures so subtle that only those who know pain recognize the value of simplicity. Daniel's wife, a strong and quietly luminous woman, became not only a partner but also a role model for his daughter. Over time, the desire to expand their family emerged. And even though the girl knew that blood ties didn't define love, her smile upon learning she was having a brother or sister was one of the most unforgettable moments in Daniel's life. When his second daughter was born, the name was chosen with care, free from the traces of the past, simply with the freshness of someone who knows that true love doesn't need to carry emotional inheritances to be eternal. In that moment, holding the baby in his arms, he knew he had finally rebuilt everything that had once been shattered. But this time, with true foundations. There were 4 of them now. A complete, real family, forged in pain, but sealed in respect and honesty. Meanwhile, Lara, despite her own maturation and rebuilding processes, felt there was something in her soul that would never return. She continued her life as best she could. She moved to another city, accepted a job in another state, invested in a more academic career, and immersed herself in research and conferences. She became respected in her field. Intelligent and articulate, she earned admiration wherever she went, but as soon as the day ended and the silence of the night arrived, the emptiness would visit her again. She tried new relationships, but none of them surpassed the initial enthusiasm. Deep down, she knew that love, the love that fills and overflows, she had lost. And not just lost, she had destroyed it with her own hands. She learned to live with it. Not with blatant regret, but with the melancholy of someone who recognizes that certain decisions, even momentarily impulsive, cost a lifetime. One afternoon, Lara was invited to speak at an event on emotional ethics and human behavior in professional relationships. It was a topic that challenged her personally, but one she accepted with equanimity. In her speech, before an attentive audience, she said that the choices we make in times of crisis reveal not only who we are, but who we will no longer be. He spoke, without naming names, about decisions that destroy more than relationships, they destroy futures. And at the end of the talk, she received a standing ovation. But as she left the stage, alone in her dressing room, the applause still echoing in the distance, she allowed herself to cry. For the first time, not out of longing, nor guilt, but with a definitive clarity, she would never love like that again. And not out of punishment. But because she knew that true love requires courage. And she, at that moment, chose to run away. Daniel, meanwhile, was about to receive an honor at the company. A recognition for his contribution to the sustainable growth of the subsidiary and the social impact of the projects he led. The event would be grand, with guests from all over the country, press coverage, and an attentive audience. But what mattered most to him was seeing, in the front row, his wife and 2 daughters. When she took the stage and took the microphone, she hesitated for a second. She took a deep breath. Then he began to speak, not about numbers or goals, but about transformation. He said the greatest work he had ever designed was not in the buildings, but in the choices he made outside the offices. He said true love begins when someone decides not to abandon themselves, even when the other abandons them. And that everything he had today, he achieved not by not being betrayed, but by choosing not to betray his own essence in the face of pain. He spoke of reconstruction, of hope, and in closing, he dedicated the recognition to his family. The audience gave a standing ovation. But he only looked at them. The 3 of them. Your whole world. As he was leaving the event, he ran into a familiar face in the crowd. It was an old mutual friend. They chatted briefly, exchanging life updates, brief smiles, and then the friend mentioned that he had recently met Lara at a seminar. He said she seemed well, but distant. That she still spoke little about the past, but hinted that there was something about her that had never healed. Daniel simply nodded, not with pity, but with silent compassion. Not for her. But for what they had both experienced. There was no resentment, no irony. Just the realization that time doesn't erase what we are, but teaches us how to deal with what we have become. When he returned home that night, he lay down next to his wife, kissed his youngest daughter on the forehead, and, before going to sleep, watched his eldest daughter cuddled with a book in the next room. And he knew that finally, the story had ended. Not with revenge, nor with vengeance. But with truth. In the end, each one got what they built with their own hands. Daniel reaped the fruits of a soul that never allowed itself to harden. Lara, in turn, learned to live with the sound of what she didn't say, with the touch of what she lost, with the silence of those who never answered her letters. And the girl grew up knowing that true love can be rebuilt. While mistakes exist, there are also choices that define who we truly are. And that what matters most, in the end, is not what life takes from us, but what we decide to do with what's left. If you've made it this far, tell us in the comments, how did this story make you feel? What part touched you most deeply? Your opinion is very important and helps this channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue receiving intense stories like this. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal. We believe in true love, honesty, respect, and the courage to be faithful, first to yourself, then to others. And may this story serve as a reflection. Because betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys homes, breaks families, destroys plans, and slowly dismantles love until nothing can be rebuilt. Those who betray may even move on, but they'll hardly find again the love they once destroyed. And when they realize, it will be too late. Remember, here on this channel, betrayal will never be romanticized. Because life is made of choices. And those who truly love choose not to hurt.